I'm Stephen Robinson. Welcome to the Playtyper Guy podcast. My guest today is Madiba Dennie, author of The Originalism Trap: How Extremists Stole the Constitution and How We, the People, Can Take It Back. So let's get into this while my wife is still listening. Hi, Madiba. How are you?
Doing well, thanks. How you doing?
I am great, and I'm really excited to talk to you about your book. I'm going to put it up on the screen again. The Originalism Trap: How Extremists Stole the Constitution and How We, the People, Can Take It Back. The first part is obviously true, and the second part is that glimmer of hope we need, because otherwise, what can we do? There's a blurb for your book from Nation writer Elie Mystal, and he talks about how the greatest trick conservatives ever pulled was convincing us originalism is even a thing or is
Mhm.
real. Can you speak to that a bit, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'll start by saying what originalism theoretically is. Its proponents would tell you that it is an interpretive method. That means the meaning of the Constitution is fixed in time. It's frozen, set when the document was enacted, when it was ratified. So like early 1800s. And the meaning doesn't change. It's possible that the applications could change, but the meaning itself remains the same. And this is an idea that only really started getting traction in the aftermath of like the civil rights movement, and really ramped up during Ronald Reagan's presidency. His Department of Justice worked very heavily to make originalism the sort of default mode of constitutional interpretation. And it is, as I guess as Ellie was saying, how convincing people that it exists is that it falls apart upon closer inspection. First of all, people don't actually know what the Constitution was understood to mean decisively at a particular point in time, hundreds of years ago. They can make sometimes reasoned judgments, or they can understand what some parts of the population thought it meant, or how it was understood among other groups, but they can't say really decisively, this is what it meant to these people. And then, second, even if they could, that doesn't necessarily mean it's right to do so. It doesn't necessarily mean it's good. I think we've seen that a lot in some recent cases in particular. The gun rights cases really come to mind, where you have some judges really struggling, like, well, uh, this particular modern law says that people who have orders of protection against them for domestic violence offenses shouldn't be allowed to possess guns. But the founders never cared about domestic violence, so it's unconstitutional to do so. It's just flatly outrageous, right?
Yeah.
So it just really doesn't make sense if you think about it for like more than 5 minutes.
The gun point is always interesting because it's always fascinating to me that we even discussed firearms from the 18th century in the same it's like we might as well call what we have today phasers from Star Trek. They're so different in the idea that who knows what they would thought. They might have said, well, maybe a child shouldn't have access to a disintegrator beam. That
Yeah.
would be weird. But this is a very difficult musket that you've got to load, and it takes
Hmm.
skill. Um,
And takes much more
yeah,
time as well.
yes, exactly. All these, and as someone who I think for a lot of liberals like ourselves, I'm assuming you are, but we've been wrapped up into giving the other side, quote unquote, the benefit of the doubt. So for myself, I've lived, oh, well, I get it. Like the Constitution was written by white men who probably didn't fully believe that I was a person or you were a person. That's not great, but that's the document. And if we wanted to say something else, it's kind of silly to think that they believed that we had rights when they clearly weren't acting that way. And if we want to um, make sure that our rights are represented, we should pass laws to do so. And that had been sort of the idea, was more of a checks and balance. As Roberts has said, calling balls and strikes. So it's the idea, no, no, look, this is what the Constitution says. Go pass a law, and then and so forth. But over time, we've seen that that's been that good faith interpretation is a bit of a lie. Is that true, or and how would you kind of clarify that in better terms than I did?
I think that's definitely true. And the advice of go pass a constitutional amendment if you disagree with what the Constitution says. I think there are a couple problems there. One is accepting that that is what the Constitution says, and that what the Constitution says was not open for debate. Another issue is the person who's saying go pass an amendment realistically knows that Congress is not about to pass any amendments, that
Mhm.
Congress is an utterly dysfunctional body, that nothing's about to happen through. But perhaps most importantly, the third point is that even if you do pass an amendment, how that amendment is interpreted can like dramatically shape like what it actually like what the actual consequences are, like how it is implemented. Like I think that there's a reasonable argument that we did pass amendments. We passed the Reconstruction Amendments. These should be understood, as I make the case in the book, as fully transformative of the Constitution as the way it was understood before. Saying like now that it is imbued for real this time with like a commitment to equality and inclusivity. There's like an effort to expand the political community instead of keeping it to this like narrow property owning white guys version. And there's stated commitments to fighting against discrimination. Like that's there in the text, but you wouldn't know it from how the court interprets the Constitution, from how they interpret the Reconstruction
Mhm.
Amendments. So even if you do get that amendment, it's still then how do you turn the words into not just words on paper? Like how do you actually implement these? And I think that's where interpretation really comes into play.
Yeah, and it's kind of this sort of simultaneous uh, conflict, because a lot of the folks will say the originalist theory, often and it's promoted from the right, is that look, come on, we all know the Constitution is written by racist white people who are sexist and don't agree with rights minorities. But how dare you say that America was ever at any point a racist country? And the weird sense is that the idea of um, um, judicial activism from liberals and liberal activism and claiming it as inventing rights, these criticisms is in certain ways pretty, going back to like certainly Thurgood Marshall and others, is sort of very embracing the idea, and almost the sort of like the Hamilton the musical sense that America is great. Look underneath, beyond that, what they meant was this is
Right.
actually more positive, right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Like if you were to take what they said seriously, if you really believe that all men are created equal and that we have certain inalienable rights, if you really think that freedom from cruel and unusual punishment is a constitutional commitment, then the world would look a lot different. So there's something to be said about we are actually being more faithful to the terms by trying to make them real, rather than just sort of resigning ourselves to the past. Because this is a core issue with originalism. It necessarily establishes some version of the past, some version of conservatives' favorite part of history, as a high watermark that people can't pass, that they can't surpass, rather. Um, Whereas I think if you look at the Constitution in the way that like Thurgood Marshall did, in the way that Frederick Douglass did, the Constitution becomes a much more forward-looking, not backwards historical-looking, aspirational document. And yes, we have had all of these problems throughout history and still ongoing in the present, but there's value in saying that the country has continued to strive. Like, yes, we have had all these horrible things going on, but at every point in history, people have been fighting against it and trying to realize those principles. And originalism ignores all of that. It pretends that that struggle was never actually happening, that there was one uniform position of an absence of rights, and it just sort of pretends, yeah, that that underlying contestation wasn't taking place.
It's interesting you bring that up. It won't surprise anyone who listens to a podcast called The Play Typer Guy or reads a newsletter called The Play Typer Guy that I'm into theater. But I'd recently seen What the Constitution Means to Me, and the author goes very much into the Reconstruction Amendments and that impact that they had, specifically of the right to privacy that was just, not discovered, probably not the wrong word, but in the 14th Amendment, recognized in the 14th Amendment. And it's sort of interesting. I occurred to me while watching this. It's like, oh, well, I grew up with everyone talking about this as some made up right or made up thing. And what are you talking about, right to privacy, which is actually older as far as being recognized than originalism.
Right.
So, and
like originalism is roughly 40, 50 years old.
Yeah. And it's all a response to, and you touched on this with Reagan, sort of a backlash to the rights revolution. And Nixon was certainly doing his part, but Reagan was one of the sort of perhaps the first,
really turbocharged it.
Yeah, since the rights revolution, the first Republican administration, it's sort of that's been their agenda, it seems, as sort of overturning that, in with the theme being, and I go back to that play of What the Constitution Means to Me, the idea of the negative and positive rights. So that's the key, the idea of like, these guys believe, okay, the right to be left alone, which is great. If you're a slave owner, you want the government to leave you alone to continue owning slaves.
Continue slaving,
or
yeah.
Yeah, exactly, to continue slaving, beating your wife, mistreated, like whatever. And positive rights is more of like, I need the government's help I'm powerless. I'm a marginalized, I'm either queer or a person of color or woman. I am, in the larger sense, power. I need government assistance to help me against the powerful. And that is sort of what, if you try to look for any sort of consistency, like people will be like, what these rulings mean? It's like, oh, actually, they're consistent. The idea is like they're going to side with the conservative majority, sides with the powerful over the folks who need help.
Right.
What do you think of those kind of that idea, the negative and positive rights?
Yeah, I think the idea of positive rights has been sorely underappreciated throughout American legal history. Yeah, that as you pointed out, the idea of being left alone, sometimes that works out well. I'm sure there are a bunch of trans people who are like, please leave me alone. Like, let me live in peace. But it completely depends. In order for people to live freely and equally and with dignity, sometimes that requires the government to step back, and sometimes that requires government intervention. It's not like a one-size-fits-all thing. But originalism was reverse engineered to maintain those sort of power imbalances that you mentioned, just to keep those structures in place and say, like, this is what was the case then, and this is what has to remain the case now in order to be legally sound. But again, that's just something they invented when they didn't like the way constitutional interpretation was going.
And I remember recently I was watching Thurgood. It's a one-man play about Thurgood Marshall, and my wife and I are watching this, and we kind of turn to each other. We just sort of realize, oh, like, he's making arguments, good faith argument, but I compare that to sort of now, where it's just be like, well, yeah, he can make these arguments to this current Supreme Court, and it wouldn't matter because they kind of come in like, I don't need to be a legal expert. I can just count. Okay, well, yeah, this is gonna lose because I can count, and that seems to be the most, to me, disturbing and alarming case, because I realized, oh wait, like Thurgood Marshall didn't have like a magic wand or do a Jedi mind trick. Like, he's just arguing legal positions, and people who we don't actually, fully know what they could have been conservative, could have been liberal. It was a unanimous decision with Brown v. Board, but they are listening, right? Like don't have, and so that kind of goes back to what you're saying about this is a court that has been hijacked by extremists, by partisan actors. Could you and someone who understands the law as you do, could you sort of put in kind of context of how dangerous that is for a sort of unaccountable branch of government?
Yeah. I mean, as you said, with 5 votes, you can do basically anything, and Republicans have 6. They have this conservative supermajority as a result of like political hardball, like forcing a Supreme Court seat to remain open until they could fill it, and then doing like a speed run to fill a seat after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and having a network of conservative acolytes like already prepared like a conveyor belt through their like work with like the Federalist Society. You can just like pick a conservative off the shelf.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like, oh, I'll have that one, please. Just ready to pop into service on the bench. And as you mentioned as well, it's largely unaccountable. Like other high-ranking government officials, like say like your elected officials, there are regular opportunities to recall them. Like you can vote the bums out, as they say. But with the Supreme Court, we have just 9 people who have these vast powers until they resign or die. Just like for the rest of their natural lives, they can do what they want, essentially. And the only real mechanism to check a justice, the formal mechanism anyway. I would argue that there are other mechanisms, but the formal mechanism is impeachment, which hasn't been used in hundreds of years. I think it was like 200-ish years ago. A Supreme Court justice was actually impeached by the House and then wasn't convicted by the Senate anyway.
Yeah. You would need a super majority, which is impossible because it's like asking the accomplice of someone robbing your house to be
Right.
like, can you stop this guy from robbing my house? It's like, no, I drove the truck over here. I'm not going to be helping. Like, what's wrong with you? So like people would like, we should do all the stuff about Clarence Thomas is terrible. It's like, well, yeah, like, but Republicans aren't going to do anything about it. Well,
Right.
these folks
Like,
lied to get confirmed. There's like, and you talked about Amy Coney Barrett. I always say that was like sort of a drive-through confirmation. Like she was like going to Starbucks. She got like a latte and the robe. Didn't actually have to get out of her car. And then like drove off. And I was writing something recently about Stephen Breyer, because there is a sense within this institution of folks who believe that we're all friends. Like, oh, I missed the good old days where we all went to have dinner after deciding who had fundamental rights and so forth. And it was like, and what struck me also though was he doesn't recognize this, but there was a period, I sort of did the history, and Nixon appointed guys who were key votes in Roe v. Wade. Like there used to not be, as you said, with the Federalist Society centerfold, it was like these folks could change their minds. And so that goes to the idea of what the argument against it, that they should ever have to face voters or face democracy, right? Is that, oh, well, they won't be beholden to the masses or whatever, but they can change their minds, or they'll read, or they'll change things and be like, hey, I know the guys at the country club disagree, but yeah, maybe segregation's a bad thing. I don't know. and not be, but those days have sort of ended, and now they're all kind of in their own
hardcore partisans,
in their own bubble, and they're hardcore partisans. But even that was a political thing, correct? Because I think after Souter, there was a rallying cry.
Yeah, the Republicans were like, "Oh, enough is enough. We do not want our judges, our justices, like making these sort of decisions that don't just reinforce our political views. Like we feel like we got a bad deal with that one. Let's think more seriously. Let's try harder to make sure we have people who will follow the party line. And so that's how you wind up getting a bench that's not just a ton more conservatives, but also those conservatives are more conservative than they
Oh
used
yeah.
to be.
Well, there's no like. So again, the idea that Gorsuch or Kavanaugh or Barrett could, with time, become a suitor or become like someone from the Warren Court. Again, these are people who were appointed by conservatives who were considered conservatives. Who were,
Yeah.
I think, Stevens was a registered Republican, but again, wound up voting. But these change. Like, no, they're only going to get worse. Like they
Right.
actually said these are going to all be Clarence Thomas types, and so
And I think
that
there are
seems like how do you
mechanisms in
fix?
place to like prevent any ideological drift as well. Like in addition to who are the people they're recruiting, they have, I think, like social reinforcement from the rest of the Federalist Society types.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for Clarence Thomas types, they know that if they keep doing what they're there to do, if they stay on the bench, they also continue to be rewarded. I think Clarence Thomas is a true believer. I'm not saying that it
Oh,
would
sure.
influence his decision making, but it could definitely influence whether or not he retires.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, but if he stays put and he can get a fancy new RV, so
well, that was interesting because that came up when he was hanging out with Harlan Crow and all this sort of stuff, and I saw the very good point made that it's not sort of bribing. He's a true believer. It's more about convincing him not to just retire and choose a more lucrative job because they don't
right.
actually. Someone had asked, like, how did Kavanaugh pay off his credit card bills? It's like, well, his parents. Do you know white people with rich parents? Like, that's how they, you have the. I think for a lot of, especially people of color, people from middle class backgrounds, I remember being like, wait a minute, how do you live in this apartment? You work at the same crap job that I do, and you've got the loan. Oh, right. Like, oh, okay, you've got
Mom and
generational
dad.
wealth. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so Clarence
But
Thomas is
Clarence doesn't
someone,
have that.
he had none of that. So it's just like, okay, well, here's Uncle Harlan. If you had generational wealth, you'd have like an aunt or uncle with money and you'd go to their private island. And I'm going to like make it as if you were part of that generational wealth.
Yeah.
And that keeps them on. But
And I think there was actually a letter that was pretty direct, where Clarence Thomas was talking to some Congress member. I don't remember which one at the moment, but was like, "Hey, man, it's financially rough out here. I'm thinking about resigning because, yeah, like I could get a much better paying job in like the big law or something." And so wouldn't you know it, like suddenly he starts getting all of these like free things and gifts and what have you. So seems seems to line up pretty well.
yeah, and just the level, when Queen Elizabeth died, we talked about how she was someone who lived through the Kennedy administration, every James Bond film. They like, Her Majesty, that's her.
Her
Her Majesty,
Majesty's, yeah, Her
that's
Majesty's Secret
her.
Service.
That's the same one. And all this time, and we think of like, oh wow, that's tremendous for one person to be in power, but and not even the degree of power that arguably Supreme Court justices have. So I think about like, wait a minute, I was watching New Jack City or something when Clarence Thomas got on what is going, like, this is 33 years that we're looking at. That just seems
A horrendously long time.
crazy to me. And I would say this if I like the brother, and I don't, but I was saying if I score it, I just feel like there's something to
Like
get
that's just
this system.
objectively.
Yeah, and it used to be like, yeah, like, okay, well, we will pick someone in their 50s, maybe even early 60s, because you've had this long, distinguished career in law. Because if you're going to be in a Supreme, you've been doing some other law for a while. And then, you will serve for maybe 10 years, 15 years. You might catch a cold because it's the 18th century and you'll die. Like, it could be like a 50. It's not that long comparatively.
now that life
And now,
tenure is like really a life tenure.
not like someone's literal lifetime. The idea
Mhm.
that there are major functioning adults who were not alive and Clarence Thomas got on the bench is
I was maybe
crazy
what,
to
a
me.
month old because it was like October 91, I
Yeah.
think. Yeah. Yeah, so I was in Pampers like
Yeah. That just seems insane. And of course, same with Coney Barrett. Like, these are people who and it can be demoralizing. It goes to my next question to you, because this feels like, okay, well, they're just gonna be here forever. Like, this just can't be. And what are our realistic, because Republicans have the court they want, they're not going to change. So what can we realistically do with an unaccountable arm of the Republican Party?
right. So I think there are a few things. Um so recognizing the court that we have, uh I think it's up to like lower courts, like the appellate level courts and the district courts and also state courts to like do what they can with those rulings to like narrow them severely. To so there's a phrase we use in law about like distinguishing a case, which is when basically you say this case might seem like it applies, but it's actually different for these reasons, and so it does not govern the outcome of this case. And you see like the Supreme Court use that sometimes when they don't want to actually follow a precedent. And I think that lower courts should get a lot more aggressive about doing that, instead of just adhering to the terribleness the Supreme Court pumps out. I think that lower courts and state courts should start building up new doctrine, and like normalizing that among like other lawyers and also among the public until it sort of gradually becomes less and less sustainable for the Supreme Court to do otherwise, without truly losing any sort of influence or credibility that it might otherwise have if it's just too far removed.
Mhm.
So that's one thing I think would be important. Um, Another thing I think important is of course making these kinds of like structural reforms of like not leaving the court as it is. Like there's ways to try to work with the court that we have, but there's also we got to change the court that we have. Like we have to make steps necessary to stop the bleeding. First of all, we need to get life tenure. We need to expand the court. Like we should not have 9 well-connected people who are just like country club buddies. Like Kavanaugh and Gorsuch literally overlapped at the same high school. Just like the same insular group of people, making these huge decisions for the whole country, for as long as they feel like it. Like that's an absurd system. Like when you say it out loud, if you try to like imagine yourself like describing our constitutional system to somebody who is unfamiliar with it, you'll be like, wait, that sounds ridiculous. Hang on, like
Mhm.
maybe I got something wrong. But no, it's an absurd system, and I think that we definitely do need structural reforms to like what the court looks like, and what the court is able to do,
Mhm.
which can take multiple different forms, like whether it's jurisdiction stripping, like limiting the kinds of things that the court has the power to make decisions about in the first place. Because if we had a working Congress, that is something Congress could do. Uh, like limiting the court's ability to make like any kinds of decisions. I know some folks argue that the Supreme Court should be able to strike down state laws as a matter of like enforcing the federal constitution, but should not be able to strike down federal laws. So there are tons of different like types of possible reforms and debates that are happening on the legal left that I think we should like really take seriously, in like looking at these as viable and looking at and promoting them as viable strategies. Because I think that people can be somewhat self-stifling by their idea of what's possible. Like overturning Roe v. Wade wasn't possible until it was.
Mm.
And so I think that people need to like identify like what their goal is and like actively work to create the court they want to see, instead of just being like, well, we're stuck like this. Like I think that we have seen such dramatic changes to the law and like to legal interpretation that should actually sort of remind us that things are not just constant and things are not a given, that we are capable of creating these kinds of dramatic changes.
And kind of going into sort of what you're saying about the lifetime tenure and the power, because again, you're looking at um, with the monarchy, or if any, when there was the ability of monarchy, especially in England, to directly impact people's lives beyond sort of showing up and cutting ribbons, but to really, they were afraid, like, okay, well, the people might get real mad and depose us or attack us and whatever. I mean, that's democracy was sort of how you kept that in check. That's how you maintained civilization,
Mm-hmm.
because people could, as Malcolm X said, the ballot or the bullet. So, okay,
Right.
well, I can peacefully make change.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like the Supreme Court has now removed the ballot and then are very upset. You know, no one's even talking about the bullet. They just don't want people writing mean articles about them or protesting outside their home. It's literally this idea that, like, okay, well, you know, you don't have a constitutional right you had for most of your life anymore. Now go
It's
away
like
and let me
almost
eat
funny,
dinner.
right? That they're like so baby soft, that they just like can't can't take it at all. Like want to be able to inflict these harms on people, and then just if all you do is say this is a problem, like not even physically endangering them or something, but just like a protest or having a mean article written about them, they're like, how dare you?
Yeah,
Like, how
yeah.
could you do this? Like, it should, yeah, I think as this goes with another thing, as a something I think should happen more, is that the justices' lives should be made really difficult. Like, just like socially, interpersonally, just give them hell. Make their lives hard. Like it should be challenging for them to be able to comfortably act the way they do.
Oh yeah, and people are going to, especially on the right, say like, "Oh my goodness, Miss Denny has recommended like torturing and showing and you know all the sort of, oh, violence. Let's like get all of this." It's like, well, no. I mean, even people running for office choose like, oh, with all this power, do I want the responsibility? It's going to be tough on my family. It's going to be tough on, there's sort of recognition that being a president carries with it certain issues. This is why I want, you know, and
And
like it's,
power over the public means you should receive public criticism.
oh yeah, like the reason that there's all these people watching to protect the president's life, the vice president's life, is that they are powerful and people are going to, could potentially hurt them because of that power. But here it's just like, okay, they don't, they get that people are saying mean things about them, but it's not like because your level of power is beyond what's reasonable. It's, and there's no way to, I mean, Alito had sort of snottily said women can always, you know, still vote or do something like that in
He
his
says as he's cutting voting rights.
in the Dobbs decision. But you know, and I think that is such the key example. I don't know if that inspired your writing of the book, but it just seemed to me the thing that blew up everything was this, because I do believe there was this long term, and I as someone who grew up watching a lot of these confirmation hearings, and specifically from more from Democrats and Republicans. Republicans are always kind of like every non-republic, you know, conservative judge is an activist who's gonna like make queerness mandatory or something like that. But um I felt like from Democrats, and I remember the late Dianne Feinstein saying this as well, that there's a sort of rules and precedence of law. That's just sort of the idea that the Supreme Court is all exalted. and that all that matters is your qualifications. And I felt like that was sort of, not to give excuses for anyone who didn't vote in 2016 or something, but I feel like if you're putting the say, oh my God, the Supreme Court's at stake, but it's like, oh, but you just said that, like, I mean, because it's not
like
like,
these messages are in conflict.
yeah, because it's not like Trump, this court, which is so radical, to me feels like the most normal thing he did. He didn't pick Stephen Miller or,
Yeah.
the Judge Weinbox or whatever from Fox News or something. He chose, like, these are people who are what would
We're
anyone,
groomed for this.
if you were to ask even liberals, okay, who are the good Republicans? We know, Marjorie Taylor Greene is bad and Bobart's bad, and these folks, but who are the good Republicans? They would say, oh, people like that. The photo would be someone like Barrett, right? Because she presents as like what normal, respectable conservatism is. But no,
she's
they
nice.
are far more radical, and the impact that she's had is far more significant. I mean, Green is a sideshow, right? And her power is much more constrained and limited. And even if she's in a gerrymandered district and could be there also for the rest of her life, in many cases, the damage she can do is nowhere near what Barrett can do. And I feel like there was like no kind of proper awareness of that in some quarters as to how radicalized these normal seeming judges could be.
I mean, we were getting these unbearably frustrating like opinion pieces in like the Times and the Washington Post that were like the liberals' case for Brett Kavanaugh, or like I'm a Democrat and here's why I support Amy Coney Barrett's nomination. And it's just like, what world are you living in? Just like, what do you think this person actually believes? Like, what do you think this person is actually going to enforce once on the court? But they're playing by this idea of, congeniality, like we all went to the like same schools and we like all rubbed the same shoulders, and that means they're good and normal and smart and reasonable, but it doesn't actually mean any of those things.
No, and hopefully that's the realization, and the takeaway is that that sort of radicalism is there, and there's that sort. I mean, especially as the cases get more absurd, not just from Roe. I mean, I think people assumed a worst case scenario of continuing to undermine abortion rights, but never outright throwing it out. That was removed, and then the idea is like, well, they would never like actually willingly enable Trump to avoid prosecution. And that's been for like, no, they can do, because when people can do whatever they want, they
do
often tend to do whatever they want. It's like the all you could eat buffet. Like, people are they're gonna make pigs of themselves. Like,
they're gonna make bad choices.
Exactly. Oh, come on, you're going for the fourth time. Are you going back? This is the Indian buffet in the middle of the day. What are you doing? But I keep seeing this, and it's
like,
disturbing.
how do you keep? Yeah, it's like you can't possibly be continuing to get fooled by this, right? Like, you're just choosing to accept this at this point, because it reminds me of Princess Bride, where when my man is like inconceivable, and they're like, you keep using that word. Like, I don't think it means what you think it means, because it keeps happening.
Yeah, this is so true. And I remember back in 2020, so what was seen as the radical idea was court expansion, and people were writing about it. And this was seen as like, oh my God, that would politicize the courts. Okay. And
it's like, ma'am, they're already political.
But you have to neutralize the power of this court. If we don't, I was talking to Megan Hatcher Mays about this a while back, was that if you didn't, this court won't demonstrably improve until, I mean,
at early
I won't be, I won't be around. You will probably, but it will be well after I'm dead, which is not great for my schedule. I would like a better court before I am
Yeah.
dead. And I don't know how you tell half the population who's lost their rights. It's like there's nothing we can really do with this court
Right.
until, to me, the most high priority is how do you neutralize the
Yeah.
power of this court? And there is no way. Some have said that, like, okay, well, if Alito leaves, and even if he's replaced by someone else, it won't be as bad. But that even seems naive, right? Like,
Uh, I think court expansion is valuable and like a democratic necessity for a bunch of reasons. But the most immediate reason is definitely that, like I said, we need to neutralize this harm. Like you need to, I think of it as like stopping the bleeding. Like we need to like cauterize this wound quickly. And the fastest constitutionally permissible way to do so would be by expanding the court. It would be by like just flat out preventing them from being able to make these decisions anymore. And yeah, so I have no doubts that court expansion is necessary. Like I wouldn't say it's the sole like fix. I want to say it's the only thing we need to do. Like court expansion alone won't solve all of the country's problems, but also the country's problems won't be solved without court expansion.
And so thank you so much for kind of working through this. I could talk to you all day about these things. I do, before we run out of time, I would like to just can you tell folks a little bit about yourself, what brought you into writing this book and what you've been up to? And because you have a very impressive career, and I want people who haven't, who might not be familiar with you to hear about it.
Thank you. Yeah, so as you rightly deduced, I think the real impetus for writing the book came after the Dobbs opinion was leaked. I think seeing that and being so filled with frustration on one hand, but also hope, and that I have the knowledge that like I know we can do better than this. Like I know that this is ridiculous, and just like wanting to get it across to law people and lay people alike that this is an absurd method of decision making, and I wanted to really like make that plain for people and like lay out how the court has been uh, rolling back our liberties and like threatening our elections and just like threatening uh, personhood period, people's ability to like live with human dignity, like under the guise of originalism, and just like seeing how clearly and forcefully it was being weaponized. I think that was sort of like a moment of okay, is enough is enough. I'm going to make this clear to people right now, and also try explain that we are thinking about the Constitution all wrong. Like we talked about the Reconstruction amendments a little bit earlier, and they play a big role in my thinking as I call for something I've termed inclusive constitutionalism, basically saying the Constitution includes and serves everyone. And so when we are interpreting any part of the Constitution, we should be thinking about how do we make an inclusive democracy real? Like what actually would make sense if we were serious about achieving the purposes of the Reconstruction amendments. Um, and so I thought, yeah, I think the raw material is there in the Constitution, and there's also like a lot of energy, a lot of righteous anger, and fear and frustration about like what the court is doing and what's going on. And I think like I need to like bring these things together to give people like here's what we can do about it, like here's how we should change things, because I do believe that the people united will never be defeated. And I think that once we like educate people on here's why what the court is doing is nonsense and here's what we could be doing instead, once we like mobilize masses in that way, then it's possible for us to create different futures. And it's useful for me to remember that people have always created different futures, even in times that look darker than these.
And you put that so well, and I think it's just perhaps to leave off on the note that, obviously what you describe, the way of viewing the Constitution, is perhaps a progressive way of looking at the Constitution, but that's very different from being partisan, being a political, tool. There's no reality, and if you expanded the court with people like Jackson, Sotomayor, Kagan, that they're gonna just say like, "Oh well, Heller's egregiously decide that you can't really have guns. What are you talking about?" Like they just don't. They would never do that, right? They do respect precedent and these basic rules. Like there's no liberal version of the conservative court that we have now. Do you
That's just
agree?
like YOLO court. It's just going ham.
um yeah, I mean that sort of has been the danger for so long. Well, and again, I'm going to put your book up, The Originalism Trap, How Extremists Stole the Constitution and How We the People Can Take It Back. Madiba, where can people find the book? When is it coming out, and where can they find you?
The book is coming out on June 4th. You can pre-order it now. It is available in a ton of different places, like wherever books are sold. Like you can get it on Amazon. You can get it at Barnes and Nobles. You can get it at Walmart, Target, what have you. You can get it on penguinrandomhouse.com, and they'll have a link to all these different booksellers there. Yeah, wherever you get your books from, you can get it there. You can also be able to get the audiobook if folks prefer that. I just finished this week recording the audiobook, so
Awesome.
people can hear me read to them.
Awesome.
Yeah, which I find very entertaining. Yeah, and I am on Blue Sky these days. My handle is at Audrey Letter Mercy. That's AUDRELAWDA Mercy.
Well, Madiba, thank you so much for joining us, for talking this through. Everyone, please pre-order that book. Pre-orders really are helpful, both with algorithms and pre-sales and all that sort of thing. So check that out, and like, share, subscribe this video, and download this podcast. And we'll check you again later. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.